So, welcome to Thesis Defense for Jenna Chapman. We're picking up my audio here. I'm Chris Ernest, and I serve as her major advisor for her master's program. So welcome everyone, and just as a reminder, if those of you who haven't been to Thesis Defense before, how it goes. So I'll give a very brief introduction. Jenna will give a presentation on her research, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and then we will boot you all out of the room, and the committee will continue to ask her more detailed questions about her thesis. So, it's my pleasure to introduce Jenna. She's a native of Washington State. She was born and raised in Spokane. And at some point, I'm not sure how early, she started having an interest in animals, and it turns out she's a true animal lover. She went to WSU in zoology thinking she would be pre-vet, so intentions to go to vet school. But started interacting with students in the student club of the Wildlife Society, and through other experiences realized she really liked working with wild animals rather than captive ones. And then she got to join in a research project on pikas with one of my colleagues over there, Lisa Shipley, and a postdoc, Megan Camp, and had to go backpacking into this place. And didn't you tell me you'd never been backpacking, but you didn't tell anybody?
Yeah, it was like my first time really camping backpacking. Yeah, I lied about it. I practiced in my room.
Totally the same thing.
She survived that, and that's kind of the story of Jenna. She's very adaptable and has a lot of grit, and I'm just going to share with you a few things. For one, when I started talking about the I-90 project and all the stuff we do, she picked bats. I haven't worked on bats for decades. She knew nothing about bats, so she had to learn all this stuff on her own and by working with collaborators, including Abby Tobin, one of the people on her committee. So that was one. And then, oh, well, of course, COVID hit, right? So that threw her field plans up in the air. It was very difficult to get out in the field. One person per vehicle. I often couldn't go, all that kind of stuff. But it also made misnetting bats something very difficult to do. And she'll talk about it. But because we didn't know at that point if humans could transmit COVID to bats, all the bat researchers were really concerned about that, so she had to kind of cut down that part of her thesis. And if you think working with bats can be dangerous, which is not really kind of cute little animals, but a lot of people think that. Sometimes another species is worse. Guess which species? So in August of 2020, she was out in the field with her field helper to move her detectors to another site. I get a message that where she was working was now closed due to a hostile male subject in the area that was threatening Forest Service employees. So I had to quick text her, call her, get her out of the field. She had to just drop everything she was doing and go back 2 weeks later after it finally cleared out. Okay, so she survived that one. And then after all the field work and gazillions of files and acoustic recordings, she managed to slog her way through that. Still all in COVID and shutdown and me not being as available. But through all this, she managed to keep going, keep plugging on, and here she is today. So she's going to talk about activity levels of bat species at interstate highways with and without wildlife underpasses in the Washington Cascades.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate that introduction. And thank you to everyone who's here, and also virtually on Zoom. I really appreciate the support always. I just want to start off with a brief introduction about bats, roads, crossing structures, and monitoring efforts that come with them. Starting off with bats. So bats belong to the order Chiroptera, which is characterized by their unique ability to fly. And this sets them apart from all other mammals. They're the only ones that can fly. There are over 1,400 species of bats worldwide. And this makes them the second largest mammalian order, second only to rodents. Most species of bats echolocate, and this is because their primary activity times are during the night, making them nocturnal. And there are 21 families of bats. It's likely that their ability to echolocate and fly are what's contributed to their success, diversity, and widespread distribution. And they are found on every continent except for Antarctica, with the exception of a few oceanic islands. Their diets are pretty wide-ranging as well. Perhaps the most famous dietary habit of bats is eating blood, but this diet is actually pretty rare and is only found in those vampire bats. Most bats feed on insects, with others feeding on fruit, nectar, pollen, and other small vertebrates. Their body size can range as well, with the smallest being the bumblebee bat, all the way down to 2 grams, so less than 1 ounce. And they can be as big as 1 kilogram, which is usually the flying foxes, like this one pictured here. This is the largest flying fox. However, most bats tend to be less than 25 grams, so less than about 2 ounces. Their lifespan sets them apart from other small mammals as well. They tend to live longer lives, 10 to 20 years. And again, something that's different than other small mammals, they don't produce as many young. On average, they produce only 1 pup a year, and this likely comes from the physical constraints and metabolic constraints associated with flight. It requires more energy, and also they just can't carry around that many young, so that restricts that. So obviously I think bats are really fascinating and unique creatures, and I love them, but why should many people care about bats? I think that the fact that they exist and our desire to preserve diversity of life on Earth should be reason enough to consider them important, but of course the economic value of animals are used as an argument for conservation efforts and funding for those conservation efforts. So what services do bats provide? One of the major ones is insect control, and so one bat in one night can consume up to 25% of its body mass. And when they're lactating females, this increases to 100% of that body mass and sometimes extending above that. And this provides large monetary benefits, especially to the agricultural industry, estimated at $4 billion annually just in pest control. They also help with seed dispersal and pollination. And so they pollinate crops such as peaches, bananas, and agave. Anybody likes tequila, you should probably care about bats because they're one of the sole pollinators of agave, which is used in tequila. Also, they help in seed dispersal, and this is really important for regeneration of tropical forests because fruit bats tend to distribute those seeds. Finally, they're also important in distributing nutrients between ecosystems like aquatic, terrestrial, and cave ecosystems. And this is because they're flying so frequently between those areas. Unfortunately, bats face a series of threats that puts their populations at risk, and are contributing to population declines. One of these threats comes from climate change. As with many other animals, the rapid, unpredictable, and seasonal changes that come with climate change make it harder for populations to resist and bounce back from those climate change effects. Also, there's the issue of commercial wind energy farms. They have been found to kill hundreds to thousands of bats from collisions with the turbines. Also, unfortunately, there's a deadly pathogen that has taken out a lot of bats, especially on the East Coast, estimating that killing up to millions of bats over there. And as of 2015, it has made its way into Washington, making it more of a concern for bats in our state. Finally, habitat loss and disturbance is a major threat to bat populations, and this comes from deforestation, that comes from timber harvesting, and also from just urban expansion, which comes with road construction. Roads, just in length, take up 4 million miles of land, and then when you take into account the lanes of the roads, it can take up about 8.8 million miles of land in the United States. Roads are obviously very important for connecting our modern day societies, but they come with a wide array of ecological impacts for wildlife, and this comes largely from habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. Also, unfortunately, wildlife vehicle collisions. Physical construction and maintenance of roads directly reduces the amount of land available to animals. For bats, removal of trees and vegetation reduces and destroys their potential roosting and foraging habitat that they rely on. Noise, light, and chemical pollution produced from roads and the vehicles that travel on them contribute to habitat degradation to those habitats near the road. And also roads alter stream networks, further contributing to those road impacts. The area over which the ecological impacts on roads can be detected in those adjacent ecosystems can be referred to as the road effect zone. And this zone is essentially areas that are too degraded to support populations, or they are areas that are avoided because there's unsuitable habitat conditions. For bats, high nighttime traffic and noise associated with vehicles are the primary factors contributing to their road effect zone. And this can operate between 300 to 500 meters. And in some cases extends all the way up to 1,000 meters away from the road. Roads also lead to habitat fragmentation, and fragmentation, where large continuous areas of land are divided into smaller, more isolated areas, leads to reductions in wildlife movement and connectivity. And this ultimately leads to decreased gene flow and genetic variation, which then makes it harder for animals to be sustained in certain areas. For bats, roads can sever their existing commuting routes, and the light and noise pollution leads to road avoidance behaviors, restricting their movement to essential habitats. Of course, roads come with collisions with cars as well, which become fatal for animals. Large animals are perhaps the more obvious wildlife vehicle collisions that we see, and this costs the most to humans, estimating at $8.3 billion annually in the United States. For animals, however, it's costly in terms of when they face road mortalities, it leads to population declines, which then ultimately makes their populations non-viable over time. For bats, this can be of particular concern because, as mentioned previously, they only produce one pup a year. So if they're experiencing losses from road mortalities, it's going to be harder for them to bounce back and make up for those losses. Fortunately, there's transportation agencies and other stakeholders have committed to creating crossing structures to help mitigate road impacts. And these crossing structures help facilitate safe passage across roads, increase connectivity, and reduce these wildlife vehicle collisions. Structures vary in design, shape, and size, but typically come in the form of overpasses and bridges such as underpasses and culverts. We are lucky enough here in Washington State to have a Department of Transportation that is committed to creating these crossing structures with the I-90 Snoqualmie Pass East project. This project is located in the Cascade Mountain Range, just east of the Cascade Crest, and it falls within the Okanagan National Forest. The goals of this project were to improve road conditions for both humans and wildlife, and this comes in the form of creating crossing structures along this 15-mile stretch of I-90 highlighted there in orange. I have been lucky enough to take part in small mammal monitoring in this I-90 project area, which is essential in understanding where these crossing structures should be, what kind of features help benefit those species, and if they're working to benefit those species and reduce impacts for them. And with this, we've collected a ton of data on small mammals, a lot of different types of small mammals as well. But monitoring efforts have yet to include bats. And despite recent studies showing that roads do have impacts on roads, and people might assume that bats can fly over the road and aren't as impacted, but they are, and recent studies have shown that crossing structures can potentially benefit them in mitigating those road impacts. So this is where my research comes in and why I wanted to assess bat species composition and activity in response to underpass presence. Specifically, I wanted to know, do all or only a subset of bat species in the nearby forest travel through habitats immediately adjacent to the highway? I also wanted to know if the activity between highway and forest areas are different. Finally, I wanted to know if bats are more active at crossing structures, so those underpasses, than at nearby unmitigated sections of the highway where the underpasses were not in place. And this last question is really trying to get at whether bats are preferentially using underpasses to cross the road. As far as my predictions go, I had predicted that there'd be more species in the forest, and those found along the highway would be a subset of those. I expected that there would be differences between highway and forest sites, and the activity would be higher in the forest. And finally, I predicted that there would be differences between areas where there were underpasses compared to those where they were not, and I expected activity to be higher at underpasses, showing that they're using them. Going forward, I'll give you some more information about my study area, study sites, study species, as well as these 4 methods that I use to collect data. And finally, I'll wrap it up with some explanations and interpretations of my results and let you know what this kind of means in the grand scheme of things. My study area is located in the I-90 Snoqualmie Pass East project area, and it consists of areas where construction has been completed, outlined here in green, and where construction has yet to be completed, outlined here in red. And my study sites fall within the transition of these 2 areas, and this is because I needed both mitigated and unmitigated sites to compare bat activity between. I had 3 locations of underpasses, my mitigated sites, 3 locations where there weren't any underpasses but will be in the future, and then 6 forest sites that are associated with each of those mitigated and unmitigated locations. Within my study area, there could potentially be 11 different bat species. There's 15 bat species that are in Washington State, so the study area could potentially cover most of them. Echolocation and flight capabilities of these species determine what habitats they use and how efficient they are in navigating those habitats. When we're looking at flight, wing morphology plays a role. If bats have short and broad wings, they're more maneuverable and are better at hovering, so this allows them to hunt prey while also avoiding obstacles more easily, which is good in more tight, cluttered areas. Bats with long and narrow wings are less maneuverable, but they're faster, so they can travel across large gaps faster. When looking at echolocation, sound characteristics plays a role. Calls with broadband calls with high frequencies travel faster, so bats can send them out and receive them faster, and this makes it best for localization of prey and obstacles, because it helps determine position and range of those things. Narrowband calls with low frequencies travel further, but they don't get back as fast. So bats can detect things that are farther away, and so they know that they can go that direction or not, but they're not going to get that information back as quickly as low frequency callers. And this is going to be best for detection. When we take into consideration these 2 factors together, it will influence how efficient bats are in navigating habitats of different structural complexity. So in clutter habitats, if you're a bat with short, broad, maneuverable wings, high frequency, you're going to fare a little bit better because you're getting that information faster, you have the ability flight-wise to move around those obstacles. And if you're in an open habitat, the long, narrow, less maneuverable wings where you're faster might be better so you can fly across them faster. And then the low frequency calls can help them better in those open habitats so that they can perceive distances from farther away. Forgot to put those up. We'll just ignore it for now. Foraging habitat is a primary requirement for bats. And in my study species, they tend to concentrate in lower elevation riparian areas, especially forest canopies, clearings, and forest edges. Old growth forests tend to be preferred by bats because they create these natural open gaps where bats can forage and more easily navigate in. Roosting habitat is also a primary requirement for bats, and this can vary, but it includes trees, snags, talus, caves, bridges, buildings, and just other sturdy areas with cavities that can protect bats from the elements and help them with mating, rearing young, hibernating during the winter, digesting food, resting, and just conserving energy. I used 4 different methods to get data on bat use and activity of crossing structures. It includes roost surveys, mist netting, forest measurements, and acoustic monitoring. And these symbols here you can kind of use to keep track of these methods throughout my presentation going forward. Starting off with roost surveys, I incorporated these so I could understand if structures are being used in more ways than just to cross the road. With this, I visually inspected structures such as underpasses and old box and pipe culverts for bats themselves or signs that bats might be roosting there. And signs that they might be roosting there include bat feces and or urine staining on those structures. From this, I was able to sample 7 different bridges, and I was able to survey them 2 to 3 times over the course of the summer of 2020. Weren't able to see any bats physically roosting, and there weren't really a lot of obvious signs of use, except at one site, which is pictured here, and I know it's hard to see, but those areas in the circle, there's little black specks, which are what we think is bat droppings, so showing that bats might be roosting in that structure. I also incorporated mist netting so I could identify and verify acoustically detected species, and I'll talk about those acoustic species in a little bit. For these mist netting efforts, with the gracious help of Abby Tobin, who's from the Department of Fish and Wildlife and does work on bats, we were able to put up nest nets at one underpass site and one forest site. And we were able to have these nets open 2 nights at each site for 4 hours after sunset. To give an idea of what these nets look like, they kind of have the same kind of design as volleyball nets to a certain extent, and you can see it up in this picture here. We have this thin, fine net stretched across poles, and we stretch that across the streams at my sites. When we captured bats, we identified them to species, and we've also recorded age, sex, and reproductive status. From this, we caught 3 California myotis individuals, and we caught them all at the underpass site, and they were all post-lactating females, showing that there's bats in the area that are reproducing and are likely still raising their young. We did not capture any bats in the forest, just a flying squirrel, but you know. Which is exciting, but not anything. Also measured some forest characteristics so I can get an idea of these clutter levels around each of my detectors. For this, I used a 0.1 hectare nested circular plot, which is about 1,000 meters in area. In this plot, I counted the total number of trees, and I also calculated basal area. And to calculate basal area, I measured the diameter at breast height of all the trees in the understory, midstory, and overstory of these plots. Basal area is essentially the cross-sectional area of a tree, so it gives you an idea of how much space trees are taking up around my detector and in those plots. From this and the help of univariate tests, I was able to determine if tree count and basal area significantly different between my different site types. I found that both variables were significantly higher at unmitigated areas of the highway. So that's these boxes in gray, and I want to make note of the symbology used in these figures because I'll be using them throughout my presentation. Green represents forest because trees are green. Gray represents roads because pavement's gray. And then hatching represents mitigated sites, and no hatching represents unmitigated sites. So with underpasses, with hatching, without underpasses, without hatching. Finally, getting into acoustic monitoring, which made up the bulk of my data collected and offered a less invasive way to quantify bat activity. I used 6 acoustic detectors, and with omnidirectional mics attached to them, elevated 3 to 4 meters off the ground. And we tried to elevate them as high as we could. I ran out of poles to strap together, but we tried to elevate them so we can reduce sound interference, and that comes from streams or like other critters on the ground, and it's also to reduce any interference that is associated with sound waves reflecting off the ground and back up to that microphone. So I set these detectors up in groups consisting of 1 unmitigated site, 1 mitigated site, where underpasses were located, represented by this black box, and their associated forest sites. That way, as bats flew across the landscape, I could get a relative sense of their activity between each of my sites. I then, after 2 nights, these groups would be rotated to the next set of groups, and this was done 3 times for each one, so each site had 6 nights of recording over the course of the summer. To process all these files that I collected on these detectors, which totaled over 30,000 files, I used Kaleidoscope Pro software. And this software allowed me to process all these calls in large batches, and also offered an auto ID feature and the ability to view the sound characteristics of these echolocation calls. I was able to use this auto ID feature in combination with manual inspection of these call characteristics to verify species in my project area. So when I'm looking at these call characteristics, the ones that help distinguish between species are the ones found here. So it's things like frequency, duration, slope, and just the overall shape of the call. So I look very closely at those things to help identify these calls to species. And since this is so time consuming and it's sometimes some species are harder to tell apart than others, I only did it for the first 2 nights at all my sites, so I didn't do it across the whole board. And overall, with this software, it helped me count the number of bat passes at all my sites. And bat passes are echolocation sequences that are that have 2 or more pulses. And so pulses are these, like, all of these sets of calls here. So that's what a bat pass was, and then I use these bat passes as a metric to quantify bat activity. I also used frequency guilds to separate the calls into 4 groups, and frequency guilds are often used as a way to account for, for this I used the characteristic frequency of these calls, first of all, which is an important factor in helping distinguish between species. So I created these groups based on that characteristic frequency, and this helped account for any ecological constraints that certain groups of species might have that others don't. So I had, my first guild was a 20 kilohertz frequency guild, which the species that could potentially be contributing to this is the hoary bat, the Townsend-Biggerita bat, and the French myotis. Next is the 30 kilohertz guild, which could be made up of the silver-haired bat, big brown bat, and western long-eared, followed by the 40 kilohertz guild with the little brown, long-legged, and western small-footed myotis, and finally the 50 kilohertz guild, which could potentially consist of the California and Yuma myotis. From the identifications of the first 2 nights of recording at each of my sites and manual verification of Auto ID and Kaleidoscope Pro, I found that 8 of the 11 potentially occurring bat species in my study area were there. So that includes the hoary bat, the silver-haired bat, big brown bat, and these 5 myotis species here. It excludes the Townsend-Biggerita bat, the French myotis, and the long-legged myotis. When looking at species composition and overall activity between these separate guilds, keeping in mind those species that could potentially be contributing to them, we can make some assumptions or guesses as to what species are contributing most to those activity levels. So in the 20 kilohertz guild, it's likely, since I only found the hoary bat in my manual identifications, it's likely that that bat is contributing most to the 20 kilohertz guild activity. The next most active group is the 30 kilohertz guild, and I found all 3 species that could potentially contribute to this activity. I found them in my manual identifications, so they all could potentially be contributing to that activity. Finally, it's followed by the 40 kilohertz guild, which is likely made up of the little brown myotis and the western small-footed myotis, potentially contributing to that activity. And finally, the 50 kilohertz guild, I found both those species in my manual identifications, so they can contribute to that activity. To assess whether bat activity varied by position, which is highway versus forest, or mitigation status, so mitigated with underpasses or unmitigated without underpasses, I used generalized linear mixed effects models. My metric for bat activity, number of passes, was in the form of counts, which inherently has a non-normal distribution, so I knew right away I had to use a general linearized model. I also had to incorporate random effects, such as the groups that my detectors were set in, the time period in which they were set out, and just site level variation. So since they had these mixed effects, I had to use a generalized linear mixed effects model. And we use these mixed effects to help better analyze and understand how my fixed effects, what I was really looking at, influences bat activity. I also found in my analyses that my response variable was over-dispersed, and this led me to use a negative binomial distribution in my models. I had models for all species combined, as well as separately for each frequency guild to really understand how activity differs between those guilds. For highway versus forest results, I found that total bat activity was higher along the highway than in the forest, and I found that for guild activity, this mostly followed the same trend, with the exception of the 50 kilohertz guild, which was actually more active in the forest. When looking at activity between mitigated sections of the highway and unmitigated sections, I didn't find any statistically significant differences between those 2 areas, but trends suggest that activity might be higher at unmitigated sites. Finally, we have all these results, but what do they mean? What could potentially explain them? And where do we go with them? As far as rooster days goes, we didn't find a lot of signs of roosting at the I-90 structures, but that doesn't mean bats don't roost in bridges. There's a lot of evidence that show bats are known to roost in bridges, and our structures actually have a lot of the ideal conditions that are found in structures that bats roost in. And so the reasons that we might not have found bats in these structures is, one, limited sampling effort. We unfortunately weren't able to sample as many surveys as we'd liked. Like Chris said, it was during COVID, it was hard to get out there more and just get into those sites. Also, it could be potentially because of the age of the structures. They're less than 10 years old. We don't really know how long it takes for bats to uptake or consider roosting in new structures, so it could be something influenced by that. Finally, from misnetting results, we had caught those 3 post-lactating females, which kind of could be a good or a bad sign. So in the good sense of things, they were found at the underpass. They were captured at the underpass. So that maybe that means they're going to be using that underpass to cross the road and won't be as affected by the road and potential collisions that come with it. It also could be bad in the sense that while they were found along the road, so they're more active, maybe not more active, but they're there, so then maybe they're more at risk for those collisions. So it's kind of hard to tell there. When looking at species composition, I did find that all species in the forest were found along the highway, which went against my predictions. I had thought that some of the Myotis species wouldn't be along the highway because studies have shown them to avoid open areas, and since that road was a large open gap, I thought they wouldn't be there. Some explanations for this includes the forest edge that's near the highway. So this edge creates a space that's more open, has less structural complexity on the highway side of it, so it's easier for bats to navigate in and expend less energy while still having that forest edge nearby with abundant prey resources. So there was a study that created artificial zones of clutter, and they found that in the uncluttered zones, activity was higher when insect abundance remained the same between cluttered and uncluttered areas. So it suggests that there might be a net benefit of feeding in this open space along the highway because they're still getting ample energy from the prey while not spending as much energy flying around that area. Okay. Also, when taking into account guild-specific or guild differences overall, we found that 20 kilohertz guild activity was the highest. And as you get down to the lower frequency guilds, we can see that activity tends to be lower in those higher frequency guilds. And with that, it's also important to note that this doesn't necessarily directly relate to bat abundance. So we don't really know if, one of the drawbacks of acoustic monitoring is we can pick up a lot of calls on the detectors and have a lot of recordings, but we don't know if that's from multiple bats flying around there or if it's just like 1 or 2 bats going back and forth a ton. So it is important to consider that. So although it allows for comparative assessment between sites, we can't really say that it represents how many bats are there. For our first forest versus highway results, I found that there was mostly higher activity along the highway. And this again can be attributed to clutter levels, like I said, that forest edge or road and the open space next to the forest edge. Less energetic requirements, still prey availability, net benefit in foraging in that area. Also, it could be attributed to linear landscape elements. So bats are known to use linear landscape elements such as hedges, tree lines, canals, anything that's kind of like a obvious linear path to navigate and orient themselves across the landscape as they travel. And so this tree line along the highway, or even the highway itself, is a linear feature that bats might use to orient themselves and know their path. So that could be a factor why the highway showed higher activities. And we did find the trend of activity being higher in the forest to be consistent with the 20, 30, and 40 kilohertz guilds. However, when looking at those guild analyses, some guilds are more active than others, suggesting that some bats might be more active along the highway than the forest as compared to others. And this is likely attributed to guild-specific adaptations and morphological constraints. So larger bats with those low-frequency callers might be restricted and aren't able to exploit those forest habitats as much as the higher frequency callers. And that might be the reason why this gap between, or that difference between highway activity and forest activity is so large for the 20 kilohertz guild, and also relatively big for the 30 kilohertz guild. As we get to that 40 kilohertz guild, we see that difference decrease. And so this may be because 40 kilohertz is kind of an intermediate range of frequency. So they could be able to exist in those clutter habitats and navigate it relatively easily, but still be able to exploit that open habitat because they're not as restricted by super high frequencies. As we get to the 50 kilohertz guild, this is where it kind of goes off those trends. and they were actually found to be higher in the forest. And this again can come with detection range and perceptual challenges associated with frequencies of their calls. As you get into the highest frequencies, the detection range and how far those calls are sent out are reduced, and this can come with perceptual challenges. So if this high frequency bat is approaching a road, it might be just a huge blind spot for them. And if you're looking down a road and you can't see a lot, are you gonna go cross it, or are you gonna like step back a second, maybe say that's not the path I want to take? So it could be that the 50 kilohertz scale just doesn't want to take that risk with the road. Finally, as when we're thinking about my mitigated versus unmitigated results, and the fact that I didn't find any statistical differences, and considering that trends might suggest that activity was higher at unmitigated sites, I want to consider the literature and results that were found in it. So in other studies, there have been signs that bats use underpasses more so than unmitigated sections of the highway, but studies have also found that bats can fly over underpasses or just tend to use areas without them more often. And when they didn't use underpasses, this was attributed to species-specific differences in echolocation and morphological characteristics. For example, open adapted species, they tend to fly higher and are found in the canopy, so when they're crossing the road, they might just not want to dip down to go under the underpasses. Another factor that can be contributing to or confounding my results here is the road gap and the proximity of the forest edge, which kind of differs between my mitigated and unmitigated sites. So I adjusted this figure to show you that at unmitigated sites, where construction hasn't been completed yet, so lanes haven't been expanded, and the gap hasn't been created or hasn't been expanded to make more room for construction, that gap is smaller than at mitigated sections of the highway. So, like I had mentioned about that perceived risk with open gaps, the increased gap at mitigated sites just might be a perceptual risk for bats, so they're not going to be around there as often. They're not going to be trying to cross the roads often because they don't want to fly into the unknown. And then also my detectors at those unmitigated sites, because there hasn't been construction that has pushed back the tree line a little bit, my detectors were closer to the tree line, which means it could be picking up more species and echolocation calls from within the forest than at my mitigated sites. Finally, another factor that can be contributing to these differences are commuting routes. There's been studies that find that bats have commuting routes that they consistently follow throughout their lives. So one study even found that if a bat had their commuting route, they wouldn't divert their course to use structures to fly safely over the road. So with lacking pre-construction data at my study sites, it's hard to know if there was commuting routes that bats tend to follow in my study area. It could be that they're not using these underpasses because there's commuting routes nearby that they're just used to and they're going to be using more than the path to go under the underpass. With all these results, what do they mean? What do they mean in the grand scheme of things? Where can we go from here? As far as recommendations go, I think in research always more sites is better. So if we could have more monitoring efforts so that we can monitor more crossing structures, this would be beneficial. And also using multiple methods at these sites are beneficial so that we can account for any biases one method might have more than another. More detectors will help with this as well. More detectors means you can set them out at more sites. Also, it means you can set them at more areas around structures so you really can get an idea of where they're using them. Are they going over, are they going under, or are they sticking to the sides of them? Long-term monitoring is also really important. That's really going to be important to determine if activity or use of these structures changes with age. It could be that these structures, like I said, are too young or too unfamiliar for bats right now, so they're just not going to be using them. Also, pre- and post-construction monitoring is really important. Luckily, with my study, I have gotten some pre-construction data at those unmitigated sites before structures are going to be placed there, but at my mitigated sites, didn't have any pre-construction monitoring, and that kind of influenced how I could interpret those results. So both sides of that are very important. With all this, my study was the first to compare bat species composition and activity at wildlife crossing structures in the I-90 project area. We were able to confirm the presence of 8 bat species in that project area and near the Cascades, and we found with these guild analyses that some species might be more affected by the road than others. Also, though my study kind of had a limited scope, we didn't have a lot of structures, it still provides very valuable data. So like I said, we got some baseline information for structures, where structures are going to be in the future, and we can kind of get a sense of how bats might be traveling around this road fragmented landscape and what factors might be contributing to use or lack of use of these structures. Finally, I have a lot of people to thank, and I'll first start with the Department of Transportation. One, for just having this project that I can take part in. Specifically, Mark, Josh, and Glenn, who have helped me get detectors, get my rabies vaccine, just help with general information about the project and access to sites. Of course, Abby Tobin was the bat biologist that I worked with who helped me learn all this new information and make sure I could identify species causes better, which made up a lot of my data. Finally, obviously this university, the department, faculty, and staff have been a huge help throughout these few years. They've always provided encouragement, great chats in the hallways, also just helps us get through everything. And also the Washington State Distinguished Fellowship in Biology for funding, which helped me get that Kaleidoscope Pro software. And bear with me while I get into this one, because this is really important to me to thank my people. And if you don't like emotions, maybe dip, because I don't know if I'm going to cry or not. First, I want to thank my graduate cohorts, both past and present. I did spend an extra year here, so my original cohort no longer is around, but they were very helpful. And the current cohort as well have been helpful in support, feedback, wine nights, shared struggles, and just venting when we need to vent. Always very important. Also, Jordan Rickman, who was a past grad student, helped give me advice as I was coming into this university, helped me with data collection, avoid hostile males. Also during data collection, I thought you were going to talk about this for a second, we did face some hornet nests, and we were swarmed by a lot of hornets while changing my detectors because there was ground nests right where I placed my detectors, unfortunately. So there's a picture somewhere with a ton of hornets on my back, but you know. Anyways, that was fun. Of course, I have to thank my family. Even though sometimes they don't really know what I'm doing, I'm terrible at responding to their messages. They've always supported me and helped me throughout this whole process and told me that, you know, I can do it, and that's really important. My support system, especially, I would not have been here. I made it to this point without them. See, I told you I was going to be emotional. So specifically, my closest friends, I have Jay, Amy, one of my best friends, Angeline. They have always been there to listen to me, encourage me to get through my mental woes and stresses, and I have them to thank a ton. Also, my coworkers from the job that I unfortunately had to work on the side to pay the bills. Eric's one of them. They listened to me complain, or not complain, I shouldn't say complain, talk about my thesis. So they've heard a lot about the thesis. They don't really know much about what it is either, but they listen to it and ask me about it, which is kind of annoying sometimes just when I'm stressing, but it's always nice for the support. And the biggest thanks that I have to give is to my advisor, Dr. Christina Ernest. I don't know how lucky I got, how I was lucky enough to get you as an advisor. There's no doubt that you were probably the #1 reason, that I made it to this point. I really considered quitting a lot because it was a lot. It's hard to deal with my mental health while in this program and while also paying the bills. And you were the most understanding and patient person throughout this whole process. You allowed me to take the break that I needed to work on myself so that I could come back and finish this like I intended in the beginning. So the fact that I'm getting my degree, I'm going to contribute to you. So thank you so much. Finally, I'm open for some questions.
Wait.